We begin with a bishop. The bishop wants to speak.
I feel I probably have something to say. Well, I think it's rather difficult to analyze the functioning of the church, either on the level of a parish or diocese, only in sociological terms. The motivation of the people involved have another dimension. The congregation of the believers is not made out of decisions of the participants. We enter into the church which we received from the time of the apostles. And the issue is not so much to discuss who has the power to do whatever, but to carry on the mission of the church. So the church is not a democracy. The church is not an enterprise, and it is simply the church. It is very different. So when you say, for instance, you mix the criteria in this diocese, for instance, they are not of the same kind. Orientation, I mean, some are more traditional linked, others are more open to whatever you want. You have this criteria. Then a criteria, sociological criteria, belonging to which social class or level. And then the criteria of the personal commitment. Some people are committed to do something, others are passive, and so on. This does not give a picture. I really can tell you, it does not give a help to understand how we function. If I understand well, your idea is to say the traditional way the church functions by top-down collegiality should be replaced by down-up participation or something like that. Well, let me finish, then you correct me. I think it is not quite, it does not correspond to the reality, because also this scheme seems to me very clerical in a sense that you deal with priests taking part or not in decisions. But in our diocese we have priests, we have also permanent deacons, we have lay people with pastoral missions, and all these people are involved. Now, if you I finish with canon law, which is very illuminating. It gives you the criteria how we function. In all decision making, the bodies which, for instance, the pastoral council, the council for economic affairs, all the council are councils. They do not decide, they give advices. The final decision is the bishop. The same at the universal level. All the Roman curia are councils. They give advices. I belong to the congregation of faith. We elaborate decisions, make proposals, the Pope decides. Because he's the only one in our system who has a legitimacy. These bodies have no apostolic legitimacy to decide. This is why the church cannot be compared to any other social body, you know? So I find it very interesting. I'm puzzled which diocese has been analyzed here. Anyway, it is not mine.
Yes. Okay. Of course, the situation is much more complex. I agree. And I'm not a complete idealist. I don't think bottom-up collegiality will works. It works if you can benefit from tabula rasa, but you don't. You cannot start from zero. The structures are already there, so you have to deal with them in many ways. But so I'm not advocating bottom-up collegiality. I'm trying to find ways of improving top-down collegiality, because that's what we have to deal with. Now, is this a good example? Maybe not. I just thought this would be an example that would bring in the two main criteria that are the two main resources that are needed to make participation work. And that is knowledge, learning of what the other side wants, and personal relationship to the other side, and on one's own side, to actually create credible commitments. And without third parties, it's hard to build, hard to have these two criteria fulfilled. Now, the diocese may not be a good example of this. I'm sorry if I thought it would catch your attention, but it was not meant to be. It was not meant to be an example. That's what I said. It was not meant to be an example of how social life works. It was meant to be an example of how important these two resources were to make participation work.
Thank you. I take that your example
Yes.
second, if sorry, yes. Why did you write before about the religious orientation of priests and not cultural orientation? I don't understand the classification made in terms of religious orientation. Third point, you talk about, of course, the two polar models, the Weberian bureaucracy and collegiality. Of course, you are aware, because if you take the work by Niskanen, who is the anti-Max Weber, he would get a different picture. Because according to Robert Niskanen, the famous American political scientist, he exactly dismissed the Weberian assumption about the bureaucracy. In that case, it is obvious that you might ask yourself whether or not today it's more relevant to reality, the Weberian or the Niskanen model. Finally, don't you believe that groupthink, in the sense of Yanis, the English political scientist, it's a major factor against participation? Groupthink occurs in many different types of organization. It seems to me that in particular today, that is the main impediment to approach a real participatory society. Thank you.
Okay, metaphor, analogy, I agree with you. I don't have anything against this. Cultural versus orientation, I don't see any problem here. This is my lack of sophistication in the right kind of language. It is cultural, but it's more than just cultural. You can look at, actually Olivier Waterblad talks about religious offers, because he thinks about constructing the relationship to the parishioners as if it were a market, okay? And the parishioners are choosing an offer. So I with Margaret's criticism, brought down this transformation from offer to orientation, and you suggest culture, and I have nothing against this. Could you repeat the name of the theoretician of Niskanen?
His book is 1972.
Okay, so I don't know him. I think I know my Max Weber quite well. And there is a sociological tradition that looks at collegiality as a different system, really different system. And in my view, we are in a society that becomes increasingly bureaucratic, not decreasingly bureaucratic, and especially a society that uses social networks and the internet to increase social control, that looks into people's genetic makeup to combine it with social networks. And I don't see I see Weberian bureaucracy developing into something that Weber could not even have thought about. I don't see it weakening. Now, groupthink for participation, a danger for participation. Yes and no, because groupthink is a sign that there is cohesion in the group. That may be why you need third parties. And to unlock the situation cognitively in terms of, or epistemically, I'd rather say epistemically. So it's a different problem that I did not deal with. I think learning could be, it is a complex process. Collective learning is a complex process, and sometimes it ends up producing groupthink, but usually with help of third parties who are in touch with the other side, groupthink disaggregates. Okay, the problem is not so much groupthink. The problem is building knowledge and experience and a definition of your own interests that takes into account the interests of the other side. I don't think that's really the issue of groupthink. Thank you.
Well, I sincerely hope this is not the point where I fall out with my favorite archbishop. Because I am very much on Emmanuel's side in this. Yes, of course the church is special. You might want to say particularly special. Every other organization would want to say also, but I'm special. And maybe even particularly special. They might not have as good claims, but I don't think that matters. And I don't think the whole thing degenerates into metaphor. Because when people seek advice, they seek advice in all sorts of organizations. It's probably the most primitive form of organizational behavior. And in previous works, Emmanuel's exemplified this for cancer research centers throughout France. As if a new technique comes along, what do? You email or you pick up the phone to your colleague who you know has greater expertise than you do in this new technique, and you profit by it, or try to. Now, just to bring this home, he was dealing with 3 levels, but it was compressed into one diagram. He was dealing with a macro upper level, a meso level, which gained most attention, and a micro level. And I think these movements between the levels is one of the greatest gifts of network analysis to what we do. And I'd like just to illustrate it, if you could bear with me for a couple of minutes, by what we do and how hard it is to get what the Academy thinks, produces, evaluates as worth having, to move between the levels, because otherwise we do not participate in the elaboration of social doctrine, which is part of our first sentence of our statutes. We're supposed to do this. How do we do it, though? Now, the top-down method, reliance on it alone, doesn't work. It hasn't worked for any of the, come on, my friend, how many of the proceedings have we produced so far? 20, nearly? 20. Who? More. Okay, more. Who has quoted them? Who has used them? We send them out postally with a very nice message to our conferences of bishops.
Maybe quoted, no, by copy, yes.
Okay. With a very nice message to our conferences of bishops throughout the world. And we wait, well, we used to. We wait for a reply which is more than an acknowledgement of receipt. A reply which says, as advice that we have given as social scientists, not as theologians, not as priests, not as moral leaders, this advice has something in it. At least it's worth exploring. If we'd had one message like that, we would feel that we had not lived in vain. But we haven't, have we? Ever. So the top-down simply doesn't work if it's left to its own devices. The encyclicals written by popes, and let's face it, we have some of the most readable encyclicals from Papa Francesco that we have ever had. They don't get read. They don't even get read in church or mentioned in church. You might like to have a look at what the Academy of, we would call it natural sciences, has to say about global warming. Hardly ever mentioned. So top-down alone is not something we can rely on. What about bottom-up? It's difficult, there are no guarantees, but at least there is interest. At first, when I joined this academy, I used to go around apologizing and prefacing every comment with, this is not theology. This is social implications of church teachings. And talking at a level of implications, there are ground-level movements, philanthropic movements, voluntary movements. Some of them become politicized, like the green or ecological movements. Now, these are the readers of Laudato Si and other relevant encyclicals. They're also, if we target them, and this has been one of my desires since I took on this an enviable job, to give little concise booklets that will be accessible to the ordinary parish churchgoer about these crucial issues like climate change, trafficking, asylum seeking, and various other, well, the outcomes of this meeting would be another example. So that's where networking becomes, to me, vital, because without these telephone calls, email messages, and then personal meetings, it may, I'm not saying that it can't grow into collegiality, it can, but it doesn't have to, for it to have some causal efficacy. And so I'm rather surprised, and I'd be quite interested, this is really the question, whether you are too, that a model that seems to work without doing any assault upon the particularity of different organizations, seems to meet with some resistance, as though it can only metaphorically convey something to us, but not empirically or theoretically constitute the building blocks for how messages and influences travel upwards and downwards, and why one is more effective sometimes than the other. Sorry if that was too long.
No, thank you very much for explaining what I wanted to say much better than I did. So I think that the participation works already as a three players game. So that means that if you want to change participation or increase it, you need to think about the intermediary level, the intermediaries. And either it means getting rid of them and relying on social networks and relying on the new powers that are presumably created for bottom-up collegiality, or it means using these infrastructures and trying to find new incentives for them. And so I don't see any other solution, but maybe it's just my lack of imagination.
No more question? Eat lunch? Okay.